All right, well, good morning and welcome. Let's go ahead and get ourselves started for today. So, this is the weekly Zoom meeting for Political Science 1, class number 30018. My name is Paul Savoy, and it is Tuesday, the 19th day of May, 2020. And several things we want to go ahead and accomplish together this morning. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to give you a few announcements and reminders because we are getting close to the end of the semester. Just a couple more weeks left for us before we wrap things up on basically on Tuesday, June 2nd. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Also, then I will remind you of a couple of important points that we talked about during last week's Zoom meeting, dealing with the subject that you have been learning about this week, dealing with the federal court system, that is the judicial branch, which the framers of our current Constitution created in Article 3 of the document. So I'll remind you of those couple of key points. I'll also go ahead and deal with any questions that you had now that you've had a chance, hopefully, to look at the notes for judicial branch, the assigned readings for the court system, as well as for the crash course videos that you looked at as well. And also, remember that our next discussion forum post assignment, which is due this coming Thursday in a couple of days at 11:59 p.m., deals with the judicial branch. So I'll take any questions that you have about the courts. And then finally, before we go ahead and wrap things up for today, I'll go ahead and introduce a really important point from the class notes that I have posted for you for this next assignment, the next topic that you'll be learning about between this Thursday and next Thursday, which deals with the two varieties of our basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States, and that is civil liberties and civil rights. And, something exciting, by the way, this next thing that we're going to be working on over the next week, civil liberties and civil rights, this is the very last bit of new material that we will be having you learn about in this class. So we are getting close to the end of the semester. So before I circle back and give you some important announcements and reminders regarding the last couple of weeks of the semester, let me remind you, as always, that this meeting is being recorded and that you can review the recording, all or in part, at your convenience via the ConferZoom link on our class Canvas page. So click on the ConferZoom link, which is towards the bottom of the left-hand main menu. Then click on the recordings link once you get there, and then finally scroll down and click on the date of the recording that you wish to review, and you again can take a look at it all or in part as many times as you want. All right. And also, if you have any questions or comments at any point during our meeting this morning, please feel free to either unmute your mic and ask, or if you'd rather, go ahead and put your question or your comment in the group chat, as Reese has already done this morning. Good morning. Good to see you. I will go ahead and acknowledge your question or comment from there as well. So that's pretty much what we have going on today. So let me start, as I said, with a few announcements and reminders. And I will be sending you a Canvas announcement with all this information a bit later on today, but I wanted to hit all of you with it first. So again, given all that we have been through this semester, both in terms of moving our class from face-to-face and online, plus just everything that's been happening to us in our lives outside of LBCC with the COVID-19 crisis, it probably feels like the spring semester 2020 has been going on for about the last 2 years. At least it feels like that for me sometimes. But guess what? We are almost done. The official end of the spring 2020 semester is Wednesday, June 3rd. So we are getting there. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm guessing you're probably going to be excited to be done with this semester and to move on to other stuff. I certainly will be as well, though I will certainly miss seeing all of you during our weekly get-togethers. But, we do have to move forward. So, here's the thing. Basically, at this point, we have 4 assignments that are left for this class. So we have 2 more discussion forum post assignments. The first one, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, is on the judicial branch, specifically on the subject of judicial review that we talked a little bit about during this meeting last week. That is due this coming Thursday. That is May 21st at 11:59 p.m. plus the 3-day grace period. And then after that, we just have one more discussion forum post assignment due. That will be due a week from this coming Wednesday. That is the 28th of May. And that is going to be the discussion forum post on the subject that we are talking about this morning a bit later on, dealing with our basic freedoms, civil liberties, and civil rights. Also due a week from this coming Thursday, May 28th, as I've already mentioned to you previously, both here and through a Canvas announcement last week, our Students' Choice Project will also be due. Again, if you haven't started your Students' Choice Project yet, or if it's been a while since you've worked on it, definitely go back, check out the assignment guidelines for the Students' Choice Project, and get working on that sooner rather than later. You don't want to wait to the last minute to go ahead and get that done. And finally, the very last assignment due in this class, due Tuesday, June 2nd at 11:59 p.m., again, plus the 3-day grace period, is our last test of the semester, test number 3. And I went ahead and opened up test number 3 for you on Canvas late last week. And as you will see when you take a look at the assignment guidelines for test number 3, it is the exact same format as what you did with test number 2. So the same 2-part format, short answers in part 1, mini essay in part 2, same point spread, 60 points total for the short answer section, 40 points total for the mini essay section, and the same completely open book and open note policy. Please also note that test number 3 is not cumulative. It is only covering the material that we've learned about in this class since test number 2. So that's a good thing. And again, I think in part 1 of the test number 3, I give you 23 terms to choose from. Pick 8 of those terms that you think you can do the best job of answering in about 3 to 4 complete sentences each. You are giving me a basic definition for that term, also telling me why that term is significant, why it's important, why we bother to talk about it in the first place. And each of your 8 responses in part 1 worth 7.5 points for a total of 60 points possible in part 1. Part 2, of course, is the mini essay section. I give you 4 questions to choose from in part 2. Pick any one of those questions and respond to that question in about 5 paragraphs. And that 5-paragraph response in part 2 is worth the remaining 40 points for the test. So, any questions, comments, problems that you have with any of our 4 remaining assignments, please feel free. Send me an email, send me a Canvas message. Stop by during my virtual student hours every Monday and Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time on Zoom. And if you want to join my virtual student hours, as always, the link and the Zoom link and the password that you will need to do that is available on our Canvas class homepage. If you scroll down past the pictures to the section labeled Basic Course Information, there you will find that Zoom link and password to join me during my virtual student hours. And if you want to talk to me one-on-one via Zoom, but you can't make my virtual student hours because of a competing class or your work schedule or whatever it is, please feel free, send me an email, send me a Canvas message, give me a few day and date combinations, and I can set up a custom Zoom link for us so we can meet one-on-one and talk during a time that fits for both of our schedules. All right. So those are the announcements and the reminders. Again, I'll send a Canvas announcement out later today with all of that information. So at this point, any questions about anything having to do with this class, remaining assignments, due dates, all of that sort of thing. Any questions about any of that stuff? Okay, got a thumbs up there. Oh, one other thing that I should remind you, because we haven't talked about this specifically since the beginning of the semester, and again, that feels like it was about 2 years ago, right? At the end of the semester, Canvas is programmed in such a way that it will automatically drop the lowest score that you have in the category combining your discussion forum posts plus the one group quiz that we still took face-to-face in the class. So the lowest score amongst all those assignments drop and is not counted towards your final course grade, as well as your lowest test score. Remember, we'll have taken 3 tests by the end of the semester. Whichever test score is your lowest is the one that will automatically drop and not be counted towards your final course grade. And the reason that I mention that, really important, is because especially as far as the tests go, it gives you potentially some options as we get to the end of the semester. So if you have missed one of the first 2 tests that we've taken this semester, then you definitely need to take test number 3. So you have 2 scores that I can count towards your final course grade. Now, if you have taken the first 2 tests, both our face-to-face test number 1 and our online test number 2, but one of those 2 scores is significantly lower than you would like it to be, then definitely please take test number 3. Let's see if we can get rid of that low score from the first 2 that you would like to have go away. Now, here's the third option. And I know that some of you in the class will fit this scenario. If you have taken the first 2 tests of the semester and you have aced them, if you have done really well on them. So in other words, if you are satisfied with the first 2 test scores that you have for this class, you do not need to take test number 3. You can simply skip test number 3 and Canvas will automatically drop it as your low test score. So again, if you are happy, if you are completely satisfied with your first 2 test scores, you can skip test number 3, not worry about it, and it just drops and goes away. So that is, of course, as I said at the beginning of the semester, the reward for you. If you've done really well on the first 2 tests, that's one less thing for you to worry about at the end of the semester, because I'm guessing in your other classes, you've got other tests. Maybe you've got cumulative finals. You have papers, presentations, all this stuff that you're worrying about at the end of the semester. That could be one less thing for you to worry about. So there you go. All right. So next thing we want to do is I want to circle back to the topic that we were talking a little bit about during our Zoom meeting together last week. And that is dealing with the subject that you've been learning about over the past week, dealing with the federal court system, the judicial branch, the last of the 3 national government branches that the framers created during the Philadelphia Convention, and they put together in Article 3 of our current Constitution. And remember, one of the 2 highlights that we talked about last week, just review, is in fact the topic of this week's discussion forum post that is due on Thursday. So now that hopefully you've had a chance to read through all of the class notes that I gave you on the judicial branch in detail, hopefully you've also had a chance to do the assigned readings on the federal courts in detail, and you've had a chance to take a look at the crash course videos. I'll ask for any questions that you have about the judicial branch in just a minute, but let me just briefly remind you of the 2 key points that I pulled up from the notes from last week. And the first one is that the framers basically spent almost no time at all creating the structure, function, powers, and process of the federal courts in Article 3 of the Constitution. In other words, as we said last week, Article 3 is barely there. It is extremely brief and extremely vague. And if you recall from our discussion last week, There were two main reasons why the framers chose to not sweat the details with the courts in Article 3. One reason, and we talked about this quite a bit last week, and the notes talk about it too, is that the framers did not at all fear the courts. The framers thought that there was almost a 0% chance of the federal courts spinning out of control, becoming too powerful, abusing their authority, threatening people's natural rights, threatening American democracy. They felt like the courts would be the weakest and the least dangerous of the three national government branches. And for that reason, you don't need to put a lot of detail into Article 3 because you don't need to box the courts in. You do not need to carefully specify what the courts can and cannot do to prevent them from abusing their power. So that's one factor that we talked about last week. The other reason, though, that we also discussed last week for the framers not putting a lot of detail into Article 3 was because the framers basically assumed that the US federal court system would essentially be a duplicate, a copy of the British court system, the British judicial model. And we talked about why the framers made that assumption last week. Remember what we said, that in the framers' eyes, the British court system, which already had been in operation for about 700 years, was the only part of the British governmental system that the framers actually liked and trusted. Unlike the British king and unlike the British court, the British parliament, the framers believed that the British court system had always treated the American colonists fairly. They treated them as they would any other British subject, any other British citizen in any part of the British Empire around the world. So they really liked the British courts. And so they said, hey, why reinvent the wheel? Let's just assume that the US federal court system will largely be a copy, with some differences, but will largely be a copy of the British model. So if that's the case, no need to put a lot of detail into Article 3, and the framers really didn't. Now, remember why that's significant. Remember why it's important that the framers said almost nothing about the courts in Article 3 of the Constitution. It allowed the US Supreme Court, the top court in the United States, very early on in our history, in 1803, to invent a massive power for itself that is not written about in Article 3, and that the framers may or may not have intended for the courts to have. So the Supreme Court in 1803 did exactly what modern presidents have done. They've taken advantage of the lack of detail in the Constitution to essentially invent new powers for themselves. And we spent a few minutes last week talking about this massive invented power from Marbury versus Madison in 1803, the power of judicial review. And remember, we said last week that judicial review power has two major components that massively empower the courts. The first element of judicial review is that the courts have the sole ability to interpret the Constitution. In other words, the courts are the only ones who get to tell all of the rest of us in the United States what the actual words of the Constitution mean in practice. And since the Constitution governs everything that happens in our government and in our political system, whoever gets the ability to interpret the Constitution gains a whole lot of power because they get to specify how government works, right? But that's only half the story, because remember, we also said last week that the second part of judicial review, created in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, is even more consequential. Once the courts interpret some piece of the Constitution, they can then strike down, that is, they can kill, get rid of, eliminate any government action that the court believes conflicts with their interpretation of that part of the Constitution. So they can strike down any action by the president, any action by the US Congress, any action by any and all of the 50 state governments. This, folks, as we said last week, is an extraordinarily massive power. So big that we said last week that judicial review, basically, when the courts do it, can transform our lives as folks living in the United States. And it's that last point, the fact that the courts using judicial review can transform the lives of all of us living in the United States, that we are going to pick up on today in a couple of minutes when we talk a little bit about the last section of new material for this semester. That is our basic freedoms, civil liberties, and civil rights. Because guess what? As we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, we know what our basic freedoms are as folks living in the United States because they're all listed in various parts of the Constitution, right? So as we'll see, all of our civil liberties and all of our civil rights are written in some degree, in some level of detail, in different parts of the Constitution, okay? Now, what that means is that since the courts are the last word on interpreting the Constitution, the courts are also the last word on what our basic freedoms consist of. The courts define what our freedoms are, how far they go, when they are available, and when and where and how and why government can sometimes limit them. And that's a big deal, because as we will learn more about in this civil liberties and civil rights section, the federal courts, especially the US Supreme Court, will change their minds over time about how they interpret a particular section of the Constitution. And so here's the deal. If the Supreme Court at some point in our history reinterprets one of our basic freedoms, that can have a huge impact on our day-to-day lives. What that means is that over time, as our various civil liberties and civil rights have been reinterpreted, sometimes we gain more freedom as folks living in the United States based on that reinterpretation, and sometimes we end up with less freedom than we used to have. So that's what I mean when I say that the courts, through this judicial review power that they invented for themselves in 1803, can completely transform our lives as folks living in the United States. So at this point, any questions about anything having to do with the judicial branch, from the class notes, from the assigned readings, from the crash course videos, or any questions about the judicial branch discussion forum assignment itself? Questions or comments, open up your mic and ask, or if you'd rather, go ahead and put your question or comment in the group chat. Anything at all before we go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about civil liberties and civil rights?
No questions, Professor.
Okay, great. Thanks, Reese. So not seeing any questions, so let's go ahead and move on. And like I said, this is a momentous occasion. We're going to talk about the last set of notes that we're going to talk about in this class for this semester, okay? And so if you take a look, when I opened up the Canvas module for you late last week on civil liberties and civil rights, I gave you 3 crash course videos to look at, and I also gave you 2 sets of class notes to review as well. And so with the time that we have available this morning, we're going to focus our attention on the first set of notes that appears for you when you go into the civil liberties and civil rights module. And that is the set of notes that is labeled General Comparison of Civil Liberties and Civil Rights. So when you pull up that set of notes, that's the one that is basically a 2-column table, right? And we have civil liberties discussed in the left-hand column of the notes and civil rights discussed in the right-hand column of the notes. Now, The reason that I did this and the reason why I, structured this first set of notes in the way that I did is because I really want to make clear, and this is the point that I'm going to emphasize with you this morning. I really wanted to make clear a fundamental mistake that is made all of the time when discussing our basic freedoms as folks living in the United States. And what makes this mistake surprising is, first of all, how often it pops up. That's one thing. But what also makes this mistake surprising is who routinely makes this mistake. So if you're watching the news on TV or looking at it online or whatever it is, so often when you hear you hear discussions about our basic freedoms being talked about, people who should know better, people who have taken Poli-Sci 1 at some point in their lives make this basic error. And the basic error that they make is that they talk about our two types of basic freedoms interchangeably. They use the terms I can't even talk now. They use the terms civil liberties and civil rights interchangeably as if the two terms mean the exact same thing. Guess what? Members of Congress do this routinely. The President of the United States does this routinely. Journalists, news reporters, other folks who should know better also do this routinely. And that's the main point that I want to clarify today. That's a mistake, okay? Civil liberties and civil rights are two types of freedoms that we have in the United States. Both our civil liberties and civil rights are discussed in different parts of the US Constitution, but they are not the same thing. The two terms should not be used interchangeably. Civil liberties and civil rights have a very interesting, rather dynamic relationship. As is laid out for you in some detail in this first set of notes, civil liberties and civil rights are very closely related with each other. They are very closely interconnected with each other. You really can't separate one from the other, but guess what? They are different concepts. They are distinct ideas. Civil liberties and civil rights look at our basic freedoms essentially from completely opposite perspectives. And that's the main point that I really want to emphasize with you this morning. Now, the best way to understand this dynamic relationship between civil liberties and civil rights is to look at it in this way. Think about civil liberties and civil rights as being two sides of the same coin. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I have my prop with me. As you see, I am holding in my hand a quarter, right? A 25-cent piece from the United States. And here's the thing. If you pull a coin out of your pocket or purse, the first thing that you will probably notice is if you examine both sides of the coin, that there are different images, there are different pictures, different words that are stamped on each side of the coin. That's true for every coin that we use here in the United States, and that is true for most coins that are used in countries all over the world. Most of the world's coins have different pictures, different images, different words stamped on each side of the coin. So each side of the coin is different. It is not identical. So let me see if I can put this close enough to the camera. Right, there is the front side of the coin, a side view of one of our very distinguished framers of the Constitution. But if you flip the coin over to the back, it is now upside down. Whoops, sorry about that. But you see a totally different image stamped onto the back of the quarter, right? Okay, that, by the way, this is On the back of this quarter is the state seal from the state of Wisconsin. And its state motto is forward. So there you go. So that's what you see. You see different pictures, different images, different words stamped on each side of the coin. And that very effectively describes the relationship between civil liberties and civil rights. Because on the one hand, civil liberties and civil rights are very closely interconnected. They are very tightly fused together, just like the two sides of this coin are very tightly fused together. There's no way that I, even if I had like a fairly high-powered laser, could go ahead and separate the two sides of this coin from each other. Wouldn't work, right? I'd probably end up melting the coin in the process, and I'd have a big mess that I'd have to deal with. So that's the first connection with civil liberties and civil rights. Just like the two sides of this coin, civil liberties and civil rights are tightly connected. They are inseparable from each other. But even though civil liberties are inseparable from civil liberties and civil rights are inseparable from each other, they're tightly fused together, they are not the same. They are distinct. They are looking at our basic freedoms from completely opposite perspectives. Each type of freedom says different things, just like the two sides of our quarter, okay? Now, is that making sense to us so far? Does everybody understand the rather dynamic relationship between civil liberties and civil rights and how they are like the two sides of the same coin? Is that making sense to us so far? Any questions or comments to this point before I get into the actual definition for each type of freedom? Okay, I got a thumbs up there. Thank you very much. So if you take a look at that first set of notes that I posted for you in the Civil Liberties and Civil Rights module on Canvas, and you take a look at the very top of that 2-column table that I created for you, you see what I'm talking about, right? Because at the very top of that table, I've gone ahead and given you on the left hand, in the left-hand column, a couple of basic definitions for civil liberties. And then on the flip side, on the right-hand side of the table, I give you a couple of basic definitions for civil rights. So for each one, I give you kind of a fancy definition, and then after that, a much more stripped down and basic definition. So let's take a look at each side of the coin. Let's look at the definitions for civil liberties and civil rights, one after the other, and you can see how this relationship works. So if you take a look at the top of the left-hand column in your notes, first of all, you see the fancier, kind of slightly more lengthy definition of civil liberties that I give you. And what do I say? It says there, civil liberties are limits on governmental actions restricting our basic freedoms. Listen to that again. Limits on governmental actions restricting our basic freedoms. Now, that's kind of a fancy way of saying a very simple, but yet also a very important thing. And that's where the second definition comes in. More simply put, civil liberties represent things that government cannot do to us. Listen to that again. Civil liberties represent things that government cannot do to us. In other words, what these two definitions of civil liberties are suggesting to us is that all of us who live in the United States, and when I say all of us, I mean all of us. I don't just mean US citizens, but I mean every person living in the United States. All of us living in this country are granted certain basic freedoms that government, and here's the key point, that government is not supposed to be able to take away from us most of the time, except during certain exceptional circumstances. So listen to that again. All of us have certain basic freedoms that government is not supposed to be able to take away from us under most circumstances. That's what we mean when we say that civil liberties represent things that government cannot do to us, things that or freedoms that government cannot take away from us, okay? And if you take a look at our current US Constitution, you will find most of our civil liberties are listed in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that the framers stuck on to the end of the document for a couple of years after the Philadelphia Convention. Okay, that's where most of our civil liberties are discussed in the Constitution. And if you look, for example, at the First Amendment, that is for many people living in the United States, that is considered to be the most important listing of civil liberties that we have. So in the First Amendment, among other things, we are told that we have a right to free speech that government cannot take away most of the time. In other words, we have the right to say what we want, when we want, how we want, where we want, and to whom we want without governmental restriction. Also in the First Amendment is our right to a free press. In other words, we are supposed to have journalists who are able to tell the public what is really going on, and government is not supposed to be able to prevent journalists from telling the public what they know, right? That's freedom of the press. Also in the First Amendment, we have some basic religious freedoms. First Amendment says that government cannot force us to worship or believe in a particular religion, okay? And by the same token, the First Amendment also says that government cannot prevent us under most circumstances from expressing our religious beliefs, okay? Also in the First Amendment, government cannot take away our right to freely assemble, meaning that we can get together and associate with and talk to whomever else we want. And government's not supposed to be able to take away our ability to do that except under certain circumstances, right? So if you think about it, and there are lots more civil liberties in the Constitution, but for many people, those 4 or 5 civil liberties that I just listed from the First Amendment are for most people the most important freedoms that we have, the most important freedoms that we have that government is not supposed to be able to take away from us most of the time. And that's what we mean by civil liberties, things that government cannot do to us, basic freedoms that government cannot take away from us, okay? So is that making sense to us so far? Any questions about what we basically mean when we talk about civil liberties? Questions or comments? Open up your mic or put something in the group chat, please. Is that making sense? Okay, great. Now, that's civil liberties. But if we flip, I'll just do this one more time because I have my coin. If we flip to the other side of the coin, flip over to the right-hand column in your notes, let's get a basic understanding of what civil rights are. Now, guess what? All of our civil rights protections are also listed in the Constitution, but they're listed in a different part of the Constitution from our civil liberties. Most of our basic civil rights protections weren't even envisioned by the framers. The framers didn't think about them. The framers didn't write about them. And we know this because we don't see civil rights protections being entered into the Constitution until after the Civil War. So in the years immediately following the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are added to the Constitution. And those are our basic statements of civil rights that we still refer to, that the Supreme Court still uses all of the time today. Now, what are civil rights? We'll take a look at the two definitions that I give you at the top of the right-hand column of your notes. We can define civil rights, first of all, as being positive actions that government must take to prevent our basic freedoms from being harmed by others. Listen to that again. Positive actions that government must take to prevent our basic freedoms from being harmed by others. So in other words, with civil rights, we're saying something really rather different than we were saying with civil liberties. Because with civil rights, we're saying, okay, we as folks living in the United States are guaranteed certain basic freedoms. But with these freedoms, government has to make sure that no one else in society takes those civil rights away from us. So here, government is given a positive responsibility. It's given a specific job. It's saying, okay, protect these people's freedoms. Do not allow other people to take away their people's civil rights. So in other words, civil rights represent things that government must do for us. And if you notice, if you compare the simplified definition of civil liberties with the simplified definition of civil rights, you get a really clear understanding how civil liberties and civil rights deal with our basic freedoms from opposite perspectives, right? Because civil liberties represent those things government cannot do to us, whereas civil rights represent those things that government must do for us. See the difference there? Both deal with our basic freedoms, but from opposite perspectives. Civil liberty says government don't take those freedoms away from the people. And civil rights says government protect those freedoms from being stolen by other people. See how that works? And that's how we should properly understand civil liberties and civil rights as being two sides of the same coin. Very tightly interconnected, pretty much fused together, inseparable, but at the same time, distinct, because they deal with our basic freedoms from opposite perspectives. Is that clear? Does that make sense? You see what we're talking about here? Any questions, comments, anything like that about the basic relationship, the similarities and differences between civil liberties and civil rights? Okay. Now, if you look at the remainder of that first set of notes, and you also take a look at the second, second set of notes that I gave you in the Canvas module for civil liberties and civil rights, there I go into a lot more detail about civil liberties and civil rights both. Now, here's the thing. As I said earlier, our civil liberties, those things that government cannot take away from us, and our civil rights, those freedoms the government must protect for us, have changed over time. Because the courts over time, since 1803, using their judicial review power, have reinterpreted our basic freedoms. They have reinterpreted pretty much all of our civil liberties and all of our civil rights. So we've seen dramatic changes in our freedoms over time. And sometimes our freedoms are expanded when the courts reinterpret, and other times they are constricted. They are shrunk when the court reinterprets. And you'll see this especially in the second set of notes, where I kind of give you an historical overview of the evolution of civil rights. There have been dramatic changes in civil rights protections and who gets them over time. For example, do you realize that it wasn't until the mid to late 1950s where students of color were allowed to attend the same public schools as Caucasian students? That basic civil right was not protected, was not recognized until the late 1950s. Why? Because previous to that, the US Supreme Court chose to interpret our civil rights in a very different way. For a long time, as you will see, the Supreme Court said, you know what? It's okay if students of color go to different public schools than Caucasian students. There's no constitutional problem there, as long as the schools are of equal quality with each other, which they never were. So as you look especially at the evolution of civil rights in the United States in the section of notes, it really is stunning. We've seen some amazing fundamental reinterpretations of our civil rights protections, but some of them have taken so long. Civil rights that a lot of us take for granted today didn't exist for most of our history. So make sure you take a look at that, as you go through the notes in more detail between now and next Thursday. So we're out of time. Time flies when you're talking about this stuff. I was going to say time flies when you're having fun, but you're probably not having fun. So what can we say? But anyway, remember, later today, I will go ahead and send out to you a detailed Canvas announcement reminding you of all of the due dates for all of the remaining assignments that we have left in this class, the last 2 discussion forum post assignments, the Student's Choice Project, and test number 3. I'll also remind you about the low score drop policy for the discussion forum post and group quiz, as well as the low score drop policy for our tests. All right. And so between now and the next time we talk, remember, we'll have another session together next Tuesday, same time, same place. Between now and then, questions, comments, problems about anything that I can help you with, whether dealing with this class or not, send me an email, send me a Canvas message, drop by during my virtual student hours, Monday and Wednesday afternoons, or tell me to set up a custom Zoom appointment with you and we can talk there too. Please reach out to me for anything that you think I can help you with. I am here for you. This is how we are all going to succeed in this class. This is how we are all going to succeed in getting through this crazy period that we are living through. Remember, you are not alone. I'm with you. I've got your back. All right? So until I see you again, be safe, take care, and it was great spending some time with you this morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.